Hello and welcome to our RSM Share Plans Uncovered series, which aims to answer your frequently asked questions about employee share incentivisation schemes. I'm Fiona Bell and with me today is Simon Adams and Martin Cooper. And we are partners in the RSM Share Plans and Reward team. Share plans can bring benefits to a company, to its employees and to its shareholders, but what can make them go wrong? Today we are identifying pitfalls so that you know what to avoid and how to achieve your company's objectives. So Simon, can I start by asking you, what are the biggest mistakes companies tend to make with share plans and cause them therefore to be ineffective?
Well, the number one mistake for me, Fiona, is failing to keep your documentation up to date. There are lots of reasons why share plans fail, and it's on many occasions a failure to keep up to date with HMRC practice, statutory guidance, the statutes themselves, as well as just keeping up with general best practice across the industry. A good example of this is the changes that we've seen with EMI options over the last decade or so, where you've had a bit of a flip-flop on how much detail you need to provide for holders of EMI options. For instance, in the past, it's been a requisite that you had to provide full details of share restrictions, whereas that's now been relaxed quite recently. So there's a real sea change insofar as how much detail you technically need to provide to option holders in order to meet the EMI conditions. Now, that's not to say that you still won't provide some of that detail that you now no longer have to provide, because you still want it to be a legally binding agreement, so it needs to be clear. And you still really want your option holders to understand what they're going to acquire. So all of these things are really important. And making sure that you're across any failures is key, because if you do fail on any of the tax advantage plans, then you might have some pretty large tax liabilities coming when you come to a transaction. So making sure you have good professional advice, people internally who will take responsibility of keeping up to date with developments, they're all really good ways of making sure that those mistakes are kept to a minimum.
Thank you, Simon. I think that's a really good idea, the idea of having somebody in the organisation, perhaps a share scheme champion, who takes control and responsibility for the share plans.
Yeah, it really works.
But Martin, Simon's just mentioned restrictions. What sort of things is he talking about there? What restrictions do we mean?
Yeah, so almost every shareholder who holds shares in a private company is going to hold them subject to restrictions. What those restrictions might be are going to vary depending on the company, but typically they're not going to be freely able to transfer their shares. They may have provisions that mean that they forfeit the shares in certain circumstances, or that they have to sell them when they leave the business. And the rules around how you disclose or don't disclose restrictions that Simon's just run through are just one example really of the constantly changing landscape of HMRC guidance and legislation, and why it's important to make sure that you keep on top of that, not only to avoid tripping up, but also to make sure that you take advantage of the significant improvements to some of the approved share schemes that have happened over the past few years to make sure you're maximising the opportunity there.
Thank you. When designing plans, it's quite common for companies to include performance conditions, and I've often seen them, they're very complex. Simon, have you got any examples of when you've seen this be a bit of a problem?
The kind of things that spring to mind is actually when you just have too many conditions and it can become overwhelming. It's so important at the beginning to work out what are the real objectives that the share plan is seeking to deal with. I can think of a number of occasions where you can really get just far too granular on an individual level when you're trying to set conditions for someone to earn an option. And that can just become conceptually just far too difficult for employees who are already trying to wrestle with their day jobs and trying to understand what can sometimes be quite a tricky tax treatment when we're coming to awarding options, shares and the like. So really keeping things simple can be quite a nice way of introducing an award to employees. Simple, but also consistent across the business so that everyone's moving in the same direction.
So I think what you're saying is that complexity can actually be a disincentive,
Completely.
Completely the opposite of what you're trying to achieve. So let's look for simple and realistic. Martin, if I could come back to you and ask about what happens when a company is looking at a potential sale of the business, or there's a new investor coming in. Maybe there's an issue with the cost, the tax position, and also I understand valuations are very important. It can be a bit of an issue?
It's exactly right. Valuations can be a really thorny issue, and that often comes to a head at the time of a transaction. So let's think about why valuations are relevant to share plans, and that's different in different types of share plans. So with something like an EMI or a CSOP, so HMRC's approved share plans, you're going to, in most cases, agree the value of the shares in advance with HMRC. Outside of the context of those approved share plans, you can't agree it in advance with HMRC. And if those shares that your employees are acquiring are within the scope of the pay-as-you-earn system, then the employer actually has an obligation to make what's called the best estimate that can reasonably be made of the value of those shares. Now that's imposing quite a high bar on an employer, and that's normally why you're going to want to take advice, get a robust independent opinion on what the value of the shares are, because when a buyer comes along to buy your company, they're going to want to make sure that the employer has met its obligations in that regard. So you're going to need to be able to demonstrate that to them.
Okay. If you're trying to put forward a valuation, what sort of information would be vital to be included and taken into account?
Well, I think the best approach that I'd always recommend businesses use is, whether you're dealing with HMRC or you're dealing with getting advice, a valuation opinion from your advisor, is just have a cards up approach. Just be completely open. The information that you do and do not need to disclose, and the information that you should and shouldn't take into account when valuing shares, what we call the information standard, and that's going to vary depending on the circumstance. And so you need to make sure you tell your advisors everything, so that they can judge what should and shouldn't be included, and so that they can get the best outcome possible.
Okay. So if you don't have a proper valuation, if there are all sorts of issues like this, then we have a risk for a potential investor or on a sale, and they might even choose to withdraw. So clearly, these are key issues that you need to think through. Thank you very much, Simon and Martin. That's been very useful. If you'd like to know more about creating a successful share plan, please do visit our website to watch the rest of our Share Plans Uncovered series, or contact us using the details below.